everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Adoption and Beyond podcast. My name is Nicole Fowler, she, her, and I am the Director of Social Services at Adoptions from the Heart and the co-host of this podcast.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise White, she, her. I am the Social Service Program Manager at Adoptions from the Heart and the other co-host of this podcast.
Here at Adoptions from the Heart, we work with LGBTQIA plus identifying clients in all aspects of the adoption triad. But for this episode, we will be focusing on children. We have a very special episode on a topic that touches many lives, supporting LGBTQIA plus youth and helping parents, biological, adoptive, or foster, understand and embrace their children's identities.
Joining us today is a remarkable guest from the Human Rights Campaign and HRC's foundation, All Children, All Families, the largest LGBTQIA plus advocacy group in the United States. Phii Regis, they, them, is ACAF's director and expert in LGBTQIA plus youth issues and support. Phii brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in creating safe, inclusive, and affirming environments for LGBTQIA youth.
Whether you're a parent, educator, or simply someone who cares about the well-being of LGBTQIA plus children, this episode is packed with valuable insights and practical advice. So without further ado, we welcome you, Phii. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
So hi, everyone. Before we start a conversation, we would like to do our first segment, What's Bussin'? Today, I have some news happening in Tennessee. The Governor Bill Lee has signed a law confirming that parents with anti-LGBTQ views are allowed to foster and adopt queer kids. The law comes after the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services proposed a new rule requiring LGBTQ foster kids to be placed in supportive environments. In its proposal, the HHS cited a growing body of research that finds LGBTQ foster kids are more likely to face abuse and harassment in foster care system than their peers. As part of the public comment period on the rule, the Tennessee Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti argued that it legally expands the HHS's authority into family law and that it will penalize foster care providers for deciding to violate their own conscience and religion. So this new law will take effect in July 1st. I know I just read this whole to you guys. I'm not sure if you guys were aware of this happening, but Nicole and Elise, as adoption social workers, what do you think of this law and how do you think it will affect the LGBTQIA children in foster care?
It was loaded. This was a tough read. And I know in an ideal world, we would have every youth in care would have a family, and that family would be affirming and understanding and loving and accepting. But that is not the reality of either of those. And so it's really tough to read this and have it be put in such a declaring way and a political policy way. So it's so difficult to see something like this, because then you think of the abuse that the children may face. And I would hope that the social workers working at any agency, public, private, that do have to follow this will ensure that children get placed into an affirming home. However, even if a child identifies as not LGBTQIA plus, that doesn't mean that they don't need to be affirmed in whatever. So what are we talking here? Is straight versus everything else, cisgender versus everything else? It's not even clear. So it was a tough read as a social worker, but I have hope and faith in the social workers in Tennessee, of all agencies, that they'll continue to, of course, put a child's safety and emotional safety first.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't really say it better, Nicole. I think just knowing the negative health outcomes of being in a home that is not affirming and accepting, the toll that can have on a child is dangerous. And so, like Nicole said, all we can do is hope that social workers across the board will do their due diligence when trying to place children into positive homes.
And I will say, I think we need affirming people to learn more about becoming a resource parent and be part of the solution to things like this. It's hard work, it's challenging, it is a roller coaster, but it is, you could change a whole world, a whole life by considering becoming a resource parent if you are an affirming, accepting, loving family. So welcome you to do the research and see if it would be right for you, because children do need homes too, ultimately, and that's a struggle for social workers as well. So that's how we can all be a part of creating a solution.
Thank you guys. Well said. And I'm very excited to listen to our conversation and learn more about some of the ways that laws like this can really affect LGBTQIA children and youth. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to go ahead and start that. Can you introduce yourself and describe your role at HRC and All Children, All Families?
Absolutely, absolutely. So my name is Phii Regis. I use they, them pronouns, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director for the All Children, All Families program. I've been with HRC almost 9 years, actually, and I've held a number of different roles within the All Children, All Families program, recently becoming the director this past July. And in my current role, I oversee all aspects of the program, from our national training program to our policy and practice work, participating agencies like Adoptions from the Heart, where we help agencies or technical assistance and model policies, et cetera, to implement LGBTQ plus inclusive policies and practices. And depending on the number of practices that are implemented, we provide them with national recognition. So I oversee that process, along with my colleague Ash Ryan, with the All Children, All Families program. A little bit more about All Children, All Families. We've actually been around since 2007, helping child welfare agencies with this work. So we're really excited for the path ahead and excited for today's conversation.
Wonderful. That's such a big job that you do, and we appreciate you sharing that with us and learning so much more today. Can you tell us what inspired you to get involved with HRC and specifically with your work with LGBTQ plus youth?
Absolutely. So honestly, my role at HRC was really this sort of perfect synergy between my own personal passions and my professional experience. So my background professionally prior to coming to HRC, you know, all centered on serving marginalized communities and ensuring that underserved communities are being advocated for, receiving equitable resources, et cetera. So I came into HRC with that lens, and as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I personally, had deep interest in the work that HRC was doing. Growing up, I would say, there are a number of things lacking, if you will, when it comes to acceptance and affirmation of LGBTQ plus youth. So that's another sort of passion I bring to this work, is really trying to be the person who I didn't have growing up, right? And to be that sort of beacon of inclusion and affirmation for the young people today. Also, I see myself, as a future foster and or adoptive parent as well. So that's another part of the personal passion that I bring to this work as well. I've previously served as a court-appointed special advocate as well, working with youth that have been impacted by different systems, whether it's juvenile justice or foster care. And that's another part of the experience that I bring into this role as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And if you don't mind explaining to us a little bit what you think are some of the common challenges that LGBTQ plus, youth, especially youth in the system, in the foster care system, may face these days. I mean, especially we don't try to get political on this podcast, but it is an election year. And, with the current political climate and everything going on, do you see some common challenges or threads or themes that our youth are facing these days?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, to your point, at the All Children, All Families program, we sit on the foundation side of HRC. So we don't dive too directly into, particular pieces of legislation or candidates, et cetera, similar to what you were flagging. But we can say that we have seen some trends, unfortunately, that are impacting the safety, permanency, and well-being of LGBTQ plus youth. and especially those involved in different systems of care. So, for example, we've seen really an unprecedented increase in the number of pieces of legislation that are aimed at trans and gender nonconforming youth, right? And one thing I wanted to point out, so HRC, every few years, we do a large scale survey of LGBTQ plus youth to better understand their identities, their experiences, et cetera. The last one we did was completed in 2023. And prior to that, it was 2017. So what we've noticed between the 2017 youth survey and the 2023 youth survey, trans and gender nonconforming youth are actually less likely to present authentically and have their gender identity affirmed at school. And it does seem that there is definitely correlation, right, between that and what's happening on a national landscape. To get a bit more granular, we know that in terms of the experiences of these young folks at home, we know only 4 in 10 report that other folks in their home, rather, we know as many as 4 in 10 report others in their home never use their correct name, and half report that they never refer to them with their correct pronouns, right? So we know that unfortunately in the homes of these young people, they're not receiving that affirmation. In school settings, we know that less than 20% of schools offer inclusive sexual education, which is really important aspect that's creating different challenges for the community today. Less than 15% of schools offer LGBTQ plus inclusive history. And these are all aspects that are important towards, healthy identity development and exploration as a young person, et cetera. Furthermore, we know, and this is something that I think is important to highlight, we are seeing these challenges widespread throughout the LGBTQ plus community, but we are also seeing a disparity between trans and gender nonconforming folks and the other members in the community. So to give a specific example, while 46% of LGBTQ plus youth reported that they never or rarely felt safe in school, 54% of trans and gender nonconforming youth indicated that they never or rarely felt safe in at least one or more school settings. So we can see that it's a higher percentage of trans and gender nonconforming youth are feeling unsafe. Additionally, we know almost 60% report some form of bullying in the past 30 days as well. So these are all challenges that are directly impacting LGBTQ plus youth in terms of their identity and their acceptance writ large.
It's so many different areas to address, and starting at home, hearing those statistics is heartbreaking. Especially home is where you're supposed to be loved and valued for who you are. And I do want to say we understand. I believe that when people are trying to use correct pronouns, trying to adapt, mistakes happen. But this sounds like it's an intentional non-confirming. And what do we do at home and at schools? What are the steps taken? How can this be helped?
A key aspect of this is ensuring that folks are receiving education, right? And that they have access to resources on increasing their knowledge on how to be affirming to LGBTQ plus youth. So for folks who are teachers, for example, or working in schools, HRC Foundation has the Welcoming Schools program, which offers training and curriculum and other resources that can help those who are working in schools to ensure they're creating an inclusive environment. And then in other settings, All Children, All Families has a number of trainings as well that are also, some of them are designed specifically for those who are adoptive or foster care parents, and some are a bit more generalized, that also will help provide that information, such as best practices when using chosen names and pronouns, and how does one practice how to use chosen name and pronouns correctly, et cetera. Those are some components. Also, we train folks on key terminology and concepts, right? Because it's important that caregivers and professionals in the education settings, that they all feel comfortable discussing sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression with young people. We want our young people to not only feel safe speaking to adults regarding their identity, but we also want to ensure that the burden is not placed on them to do that education. So that's another reason why doing, that education and learning on one's own is really important here. Another thing that we recommend that folks consider is connecting young people with resources, right? How can you ensure that LGBTQ plus youth are connected with resources that are affirming to their identity, whether it's different forms of support groups or whether it's your local LGBTQ plus center? That's an important aspect of working to combat some of the challenges that I was mentioning in my last response.
Thank you so much. Fee, those are great points to take away and action steps that people can actually take to help provide more inclusive environments, not only in school, but also at home. And I'm just wondering, for those parents or caregivers who may be struggling for whatever reason to accept their child's identity, um, what advice might you give to those individuals and how they can really work to help themselves and help their child?
Well, actually, that ties in well with my last response as well, because that education is a key component of helping any caregiver sort of navigate these struggles, right? Because these resources can provide the information to help caregivers understand different aspects of LGBTQ plus identity. It's important that caregivers feel supported who might be having struggles, right? And at the same time, it's also really important that they're avoiding sharing those struggles with a young person, right? We don't want the LGBTQ plus young person to feel the burden of whatever struggles or challenges the caregiver might be having. So while it's relatively common, sort of human experience maybe to have some challenges initially, especially for those who may have, certain backgrounds and beliefs, et cetera, it's important to, again, avoid burdening the young person with that information. Also to understand what is the impact if I am being rejecting towards the young person in my care, right? Because we know there's extensive research on the impact of caregivers who are rejecting to a young person's identity. Specifically in adoption and foster care, we know that has a direct impact on permanency. When a caregiver is struggling to accept and struggling to be affirming to a child's LGBTQ plus identity, that can result in the young person feeling unsafe in that home. And sometimes that can even result in the young person running away or becoming unhoused, right? We know that LGBTQ plus youth represent 40% of unhoused youth in some cases. That's another reason why it's important that we avoid rejecting our child's LGBTQ plus identity, and we work to ensure that they're feeling supported. I think something important here that I love to highlight is something called the Family Acceptance Project from Dr. Caitlin Ryan. It's a really important body of research regarding family acceptance. And it underscores how young people who are in highly rejecting environments at home face really negative health outcomes that I would say most caregivers, if not all, can agree they don't want the young person to navigate. So, for example, risks of suicide attempts, substance misuse, HIV infection, and other negative health outcomes. All of those likelihoods increase depending on how highly rejecting that environment is. So, if ultimately we want what's best for the young person, we have to ensure that we're avoiding those outcomes, right? And in some cases, we might not be able to change our beliefs, or values, et cetera, as much as I may wish that I can change everyone's heart and mind, right? That's not always possible. And in those cases, the Family Acceptance Project recommends focusing on behaviors, right? If you can't change your beliefs, how can you focus on the behaviors that you're exhibiting that might be rejecting towards that young person? that might be a great place to start.
It's all such wonderful information for those who also approve the home studies for the families that adopt or foster or caregive guardianship. We have so many families say to us, well, we'll learn more about race when we know who our child is going to be. We'll learn more about intersectionality. No, that's the whole point, is everybody's going to have a different intersectionality and a different identity. And these are your child's friends. Even if you have a child that isn't of a different race than you, isn't of a different identifier as you, we need to learn that now. This is the world that we live in. These are all of the kids at school. We need to care about advocating for everybody. And so this is such valuable information to really search your values and what you believe in now before the process starts, to be able to see if this is the right landscape for you. If 40% identify as LGBTQIA plus, will you be providing for them? And in that too, what are some signs that a child might be struggling with their identity, and how can parents start to approach those conversations sensitively?
Yeah. And a couple of quick things. So to clarify, it's 40% of LGBTQ of unhoused youth.
Unhoused. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. It's 1 in 3 or 30% in foster care who identify as LGBTQ plus. But I think something that you just said is really important to pull out here, or unpack rather. Even though 30% of youth in foster identify as LGBTQ plus, those are just the young people who have reported their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. We know that LGBTQ plus youth are often re-traumatized once they enter care, whether that's from the other young people who are in foster care or the professionals who might not have the training to ensure that they're not doing harm to a young person, right? So if a young person is not feeling safe in those environments, there's no saying that they would disclose their LGBTQ plus identity, right? So more than likely, the percentage is even higher than 30%. So all of that to say, even if a young person who is placed in your care doesn't identify as LGBTQ plus openly at that time, there's no saying that maybe internally they already identify as LGBTQ plus and they just haven't shared it yet. Or maybe they're questioning and they're in the process of exploring their identity, and maybe in a few years they might determine that they identify as LGBTQ plus. So to your point, that's why it's really important to do the work now, and to ensure that regardless of the young person in your care, that you are affirming to LGBTQ plus folks, because again, we don't know how that young person's identity will develop. And also, being affirming is important for non-LGBTQ plus youth as well. We know that unfortunately, young people learn hateful stereotypes, et cetera, oftentimes at home. So the more we're creating that affirming environment and ensuring that young people aren't hearing these rejecting thoughts, et cetera, the better off all our young people will be. And to get to speak to your question that you just asked, I'll say something to be mindful of here. Sometimes I think there can be, and I'm not saying this is what you're implying, but sometimes there can be a misconception that when a young person is exploring their identity, that they're struggling with their identity. A young person who's exploring their identity, they might not experience that as a struggle. They might, again, just be learning who they are, which is common for all young people, not just LGBTQ plus young people, right? And what we find is sometimes if you are finding that an LGBTQ plus young person is struggling with their identity, sometimes that might be because there's some real or perceived rejection that they're experiencing. So if you're noticing that struggle, it may be related to something they're experiencing in the environment around them. It may be related to messages they're receiving from you or not receiving from you. I also think it's important to believe LGBTQ plus young people for who they say they are right now. We know that, for example, gender fluid young folks, they might experience their gender identity differently on a day-to-day basis, right? And sometimes from an outside perspective, someone might perceive that as struggling with their identity and they're not sure of how they identify, when in reality, that might just be how they're authentically experiencing their identity as well. So it's important to believe young people for where they are now, and for us to remain curious and open to what they have to share with us. Also, that's another reason, to my earlier point, why being inclusive and using inclusive language, et cetera, is so important, because that can help ensure that if a young person is struggling with their identity, if they hear their caregiver modeling inclusive language and sharing affirming viewpoints on the LGBTQ plus community, that might help a young person mitigate some of the struggles they might happen to be navigating. And the last thing I'll say is also, are there ways that you can indicate to this young person that they'll be welcomed in your home, even if perhaps they're not ready to have that conversation with you? Is there perhaps a sticker you can put up that says that, it's an LGBTQ plus safe zone or something along those lines? If you've done the work to ensure that you're affirming and inclusive, having that cue for the young person to know that you've made that commitment is important and might help a young person who perhaps might be struggling with their identity.
Right now, we're going to move into our second segment, Ask Anything. So during this segment, as you guys know, we answer questions that our listeners have. So if you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments below on our YouTube channel or in the comment box in Spotify. So today we have a question from Oliver. Oliver asks, my partner and I want to adopt a child, but we have been worried that we will not be picked since I am trans and my partner is queer. I know many agencies work with gay and lesbian couples, but how common is it for agencies to be able to work with people of other identities? And how likely are expecting mothers to pick a couple like us?
Thank you, Oliver, for asking that. And this is, you are not alone. This is definitely a common question that we have. And there's so many different routes of adoption, and being chosen or being placed varies differently. So the way I'm reading this question is more like a private agency where an expectant parent chooses a family. I've lived inside the adoptions from the heart realm for so long, where we accept families of all backgrounds, that I don't really know much about other agencies. And what I would say, look for HRC approved agencies that actually put in the training and the work to be able to do that. We would welcome you here to go through the home study process and be approved for adoption. The big question that I know other people have a lot is, will we get chosen? And I can say that we have worked with families of all different backgrounds, of all different makeups, and that is a common question that we have. And I always say to every family, this is not specific to a family makeup, be transparent to who you are, and somebody will connect with that. If somebody doesn't choose you, it's not anything personal. It's not anything, I can't say what exactly it is, but the right time is coming, and the right expectant parent and child is coming. So just always be genuine and transparent to who you are, and somebody will connect with that.
Nicole, and I think it's important that you stated, when you're looking for an agency, yeah, of course, A, ask their values, but B, make sure that they can back that up with something like being HRC approved. Asking, what kind of training does your social workers have in terms of different backgrounds, whether it be different racial backgrounds, sexual orientations, that as we've talked a lot about today, the different intersecting identities. Is your staff not only prepared but trained on all of those different things is so, so important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
It's a great question to ask, just straight up ask agencies. Doing your research is so involved. As a prospective adoptive family looking for, an agency to go through one of the biggest life changes. So you will be reaching out to lots of different agencies, and I like that. Just straight up ask everybody that you talk to.
Well, thank you guys so much, and we will get back to our conversation.
Great things to think about for parents and for caregivers, and for those parents and caregivers that are affirming at home and accept and love their child for who they are, but maybe that child is not experiencing those same affirmations at school. You gave us those incredibly sad statistics about bullying, the bullying rates in school, and those with suicidal ideations because they're not being accepted or affirmed. For those parents that are seeing their children struggle with these things, or children that are telling their parents, I'm struggling with these things. What are some action steps, or some resources or things that these parents can do for their children, to help them if they're seeing signs of, depression or any sort of mental awareness that these parents can have for their children that may be struggling?
Absolutely. Well, in these cases, specifically if you're seeing signs of depression or other forms of challenges to a young person's mental health, it's important to ensure that you are getting the appropriate professionals involved. However, what's key here is ensuring that we're doing our due diligence to determine whether the provider is going to be affirming to the young person. Because something that we found in the youth survey that I was mentioning at the top of our conversation is that while more LGBTQ plus youth might be connected with mental health providers than in the past, we are still finding that those mental health providers aren't necessarily meeting their needs once they enter care. So it's important that if you're noticing, those struggles in a young person, and you're seeking out that care for them, that we're reaching out ahead of time, we're doing the research to find out who are the affirming providers in our local area. How can we ensure that those services that are going to be provided to the young person are affirming? So that's where I would say is a really important place to start. Something that I also like to mention here is being mindful that LGBTQ plus folks often have multiple marginalized identities, especially if we're talking about young people in the foster care system, right? We know that not only are LGBTQ plus youth disproportionately represented in foster care, but we also know that's the case for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are in the child welfare system as well. So for that reason, it's important to also approach these challenges with an intersectional lens and ensure that we are considering the full depth of a person's and the full dimensions of a person's identity. At any given moment, the struggle they might be facing may not be directly tied to their LGBTQ plus identity, or maybe it is, and it's also tied to another a marginalized identity that they hold. Ensuring that not only are you connecting these young people with affirming mental health providers, but that there are other resources that are affirming as well. That's a key aspect in providing support when a young person is struggling. Whether it's an affirming support group for LGBTQ plus youth, or especially online these days, we're seeing that some of these support groups can be even more sort of granular when it comes to identity, right? Where we're finding there are even support groups that are specifically for, for example, for Black, queer, and trans young people. How can we identify those resources to ensure that a young person who might be facing challenges and struggling can see themselves represented in a positive way in those spaces, and ultimately, hear from other folks who might be having similar experiences as them as well.
The virtual landscape now and space now can be helpful for mental health providers and support groups. Spaces that used to maybe not have those resources, if you live in a more rural area or anything, there's so much more access. And like you said, you as a parent need to do the research and find this for any child that comes into your home, considering all of their intersectionality.
Mhm.
How can listeners get involved or support HRC's mission in advocating for youth and support?
Well, specifically when it comes to the work that All Children, All Families does, there are a number of ways that folks can get involved. Regardless of where folks are in the country, there there are going to be organizations that are working directly in child welfare in their area, right? So ensuring that those local organizations and child welfare agencies are aware of the work that All Children, All Families is doing, right? Ensuring, because that is a very sort of low hanging fruit, if you will, opportunity for you all to ensure that your local child welfare agencies are being connected with inclusive policies and practices and staff training, et cetera. Ultimately, that's how we can help ensure that the young people who are being served by the child welfare field, that they are being served by institutions that have those inclusive policies and practices. That's one thing I'll highlight here that I was going to share a bit earlier. That's one of the really sort of positive signs we're seeing when it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusion. To be more specific, past 5 years that I've been with the program, I've seen such a steady increase in the number of agencies that are committing to LGBTQ plus inclusive policies and practices, where the number of young people that are being served by agencies with inclusive policies and practices went from about 400,000 a few years ago to 1.4 million today. So how can you be a part of that change? How can you be a part of the work to ensure that more child welfare agencies are implementing these inclusive policies, to ensure that ultimately more young people are being served by these agencies with inclusive policies and with professionals that are trained as well? Over the past few years, we've seen our training jump from a couple of thousand to over 10,000 every year, right? In all 50 states and beyond. Also ensuring that you're amplifying training like some of the offerings that All Children, All Families has, right? That's another key aspect of supporting this work, is ensuring that professionals are being connected to resources that can provide them that training, right? And it's not just professionals, it's also caregivers as well. We have resources for caregivers. So I would recommend a great starting place is hrc.im/ACAF participation. That's a great place to get started to learn more about the work of the All Children, All Families program, and to get connected with some of those resources that I was flagging that are important to lift up and share with folks in your network. Those are some of the ways I'd recommend folks help push forward the work of All Children, All Families.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that information. And as a professional, I find it can be, and as a foster parent myself, I find it difficult. And you had mentioned before, and I want to go back there with, we need resource families for children. And what if they're not affirming, but accepting? And you had mentioned focusing on the behavior. So what is your advice to a professional certifying homes for children, and also then moving forward with the families and behaviors?
Absolutely. What I'm going to mention here are some of the policies and practices that we help agencies to implement. So, for example, I would highlight it's important to ensure that as part of that process, you're assessing whether resource parents can be affirming and inclusive, right? At very early stages in your process with these resource families, it's important to ask questions to determine their openness and their readiness to support an LGBTQ plus young person, right? And it's also important to explore that with a bit more granularity, right? It's not a binary where it's either they're able to support the young person or they're not. We recommend looking at it with more nuance. If someone is not, if they indicate they're not ready to support an LGBTQ plus young person right now, would that person be more ready if they were connected with resources and training? It's not just yes or no. Sometimes the folks who might be a no right now, they might be, part of that movable middle, as folks may have heard in other contexts, right? With the proper training and resources, et cetera, where we might be able to shift them to being ready to be a bit more inclusive. I think that's what I would begin to flag there. And can you share the second part of your question?
Said that, if somebody's not really in an affirming space, to focus on behaviors. Can you explain that a bit more?
Absolutely. So there are certain behaviors. So specifically, I'm again referring to the Family Acceptance Project from Dr. Caitlin Ryan. There's specific behaviors that were identified as rejecting versus accepting. And those rejecting behaviors are what contribute to those negative health outcomes that I was flagging. We recommend Instead, looking to more accepting behaviors like talking with a young person about their identity, expressing affection when they tell you about their identity, bringing the child to LGBTQ plus organizations and events, supporting the child's gender expression, helping the child understand that they can have a happy future as an LGBTQ plus adult. Depending on different settings that the young person may be in, how can you help ensure that environment is supportive and affirming, right? Whether it's a faith community or other, extended members of the family, how can we do our due diligence to create those supportive environments for the young person before exposing them to those spaces before they might experience that rejection? That's a bit more about what I mean when I say accepting behaviors versus those that are rejecting. And we find that that's key. Again, when young people are experiencing, this level of acceptance, we know that directly impacts the likelihood that they'll be able to perceive themselves as a happy LGBT plus adult. So that's what I would share there. Does that help clarify that?
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And Phii, do you mind just circling back to talk a little bit more? Because I think you've done such a wonderful job in talking about how can we as parents, as caregivers, really support the children in our homes. But half of our kids' lives are spent in school as
Mhm.
well. And I know you talked a little bit about the program that you all have designed for schools and school systems. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about what that looks like, how schools can get involved, how what they can implement in order for their school environment to be more accepting, more affirming for every student that's there.
So that program, it's the Welcoming Schools program at the HRC Foundation. And I can ensure that I provide you with the URL, et cetera, to ensure that listeners can directly access the program's website and understand what resources they have available. But specifically, they train education professionals on how to combat any bias-based bullying. So it extends actually beyond just bullying based on LGBTQ plus identity. It's really any bias-based bullying. And they also provide examples of inclusive lesson plans and inclusive curriculum, right? So those are some of the ways that the Welcoming Schools program specifically can be helpful. And now for education professionals who maybe they still have to talk to leadership about engaging in a program like Welcoming Schools, there are steps they can take now. So where possible, how can you post positive and LGBTQ plus affirming symbols such as pride flags and safe space stickers in your classroom and school? How can you talk to leadership at your school about whether there's a process to address bias-based harassment and violence that explicitly protects LGBTQ plus students? How can you create space to intentionally check in on LGBTQ plus students about their experiences with harassment and violence? If it doesn't currently exist, can you create or support a gender and sexuality alliance at the school as well? Then there are also sort of more day-to-day things that folks can do as well, such as using gender inclusive language. If you're addressing a classroom, oftentimes we don't know the gender identity of every young person in that space. So avoiding language like boys and girls, which for a non-binary young person, they might feel excluded with language like that. So how can we shift to language like folks or something like that? I'm originally from New York. I never thought I would say y'all so much, but y'all is another example of inclusive way to address a group of people when you don't know their identity. How can you avoid assuming a young person's pronouns? Because that's an important aspect of this as well. We definitely want to ensure that folks working in schools feel empowered to discuss to ask a young person what their pronouns are, right? And to create opportunities for young people to share their pronouns with them.
I think people often forget the importance of inclusive language. I mean, here at Adoptions from the Heart, we have a cheat sheet on positive adoption language, right? But it goes so far beyond that to really be able to include people as a whole and all of their intersecting identities and the importance of that. And for those that want to learn more about that, I know you have a lot of resources. HRC, we take HRC training. We love it. We highly recommend it to everyone listening, whether you're a parent, a caregiver, a professional, or somebody that just wants to learn more and do better. So, Fee, do you have any, parting thoughts or final advice, words of encouragement that you can offer to anyone listening that may be involved in any different way with LGBTQ plus youth and children?
Absolutely. I think I'll leave everyone with the stories that I've heard from a young person with experiences in care that I found very moving and encouraging at the same time. There's a young person who was being served by one of the agencies participating in the All Children, All Families program, who prior to entering that agency had experienced, unfortunately, a lot of abuse and discrimination based on their identity. But because this agency had implemented inclusive policies and practices, and knew how to take the steps to recruit affirming resource parents, et cetera, this young person, when they entered the agency, they were able to be placed with a resource parent who was affirming, right? And to hear from this young person about the difference that that has made in their life, truly, it warms my heart every time, and honestly usually brings me to tears, because it's really just exceptional to see how significant of an impact that one person can have on a young person's life. That's something that's actually backed up by research, right? The Trevor Project has a research that shows that having just one affirming adult in an LGBTQ plus young person's life can significantly decrease the chances that they'll ever attempt suicide. You might literally be able to save a young person's life by being affirming, by letting them know that even if they may face rejection outside, they can always come to you to find that affirmation and support. What greater power is that, right? I hope folks feel empowered by that. You can literally save the lives of young people around you by doing the work you need to understand and learn about being inclusive, right? And then creating that space for them, right? You have that power. And I think that's really special. And yeah, one person has the ability to change a life. And I hope that, folks connect with resources from all children, all families, and other inclusive and affirming resources, so that they can create those spaces for young people around them.
It is so, powerful to think about how far acceptance and inclusion and positive affirmation can go in one individual's life. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing with us. And for our listeners that want to learn more about HRC and the work that you do and find additional resources, where can they go for that?
Absolutely. So for the All Children, All Families program, the best place to go is hrc.org/ACAF. That's where I would recommend getting started. And to keep up with other HRC programs, I encourage folks to follow HRC on social media. That's a great place to ensure that you're staying up to date with different resources that we may have, and other organizational priorities. So those are the two starting points that I would flag for folks.
Great. And we will link those resources for all of our listeners as well. Thank you so much for being here with us today, sharing with us. It was educational for us, hopefully for our listeners as well, and really just valuable information. So we thank you so much.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'll quickly say as we close, HRC has been around since the 1980s. And last year was the first time in our entire history that we declared a national state of emergency for the LGBTQ plus community. The first time in over 40 years. And that's tied to some of the challenges that I've been flagging throughout today's conversation. So I just want to thank you both and thank your organization for having conversations like this, because it truly, truly is more important than ever. I just want to express my gratitude to you both and to your organization for creating this space and for having this important conversation.
Thank
Thank
you. You are a role model for action in the community. And I admire that. And I appreciate so much you sharing with us here today, your experiences and your knowledge.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
Elise, what a great conversation we all had today. I could listen to Phii talk forever, and I hope that we get to talk to them soon again in the future. Can you share what your takeaway was from this episode?
Absolutely. There was a lot of takeaways. Today's conversation was so informative. I think one of the things that Fee mentioned that really hit home for me was the impact of a child having just one person in their life that's affirming, and the positive impact that that can have on the child. And just the realization that you can be that person in a child's life, whether they're your child or not. It might be a child's school teacher that is that person for them. But I think it's a great reminder of the fact that we all can do more, we all can do better, but the fact that we can be that one person for a child is so important. And I think it's something that we should all remember every day when we're speaking to our youth, in particular, and the way that we're speaking to our youth. Nicole, what about you?
Well said. That definitely from the heart. And I hope that spoke to other people too. I appreciate you sharing that. For me, too, more on the education side of things, I'm thinking about things to include in educational pieces. We have language on adoption language, just like you said, Elise, and we have different ability language and language on intersecting identities. And we do have that, but something specific for this because these are adoptive parents' kids all grown up, or a foster parent's child coming in. So this is really important stuff, and I appreciated all aspects of the conversations we've had today. All right, that brings us to the end of today's enlightening episode. A big thank you to Phii Regis from the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, and All Children, All Families, ACAF, for sharing the invaluable insights and expertise on how parents can support LGBTQIA+ children.
We hope this discussion has provided you with the tools and understanding needed to create a more inclusive and affirming environment for your child. For more information about the Human Rights Campaign and the resources that they offer, be sure to visit their website, hrc.org. You can also follow them on social media for updates and additional support.
As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Adoption and Beyond podcast and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to continue to bring you meaningful content. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends and family who might benefit from this important conversation. They will be around your children as well.
And if you have not already, please head over to our website, www.afth.org, for more information on our services for pregnant people, prospective adoptive parents, and professionals looking to learn more about adoption. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to connecting again.